You all know that I've been talking about the DCAU for over a year now. And in that time, I've managed to talk about Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, and Batman Beyond. So as I'm currently working on my Justice League video, I thought I'd take a bit of time to look at every video game based on the DCAU. There are surprisingly quite a few games based on different DCAU shows, and I plan to cover all of them in order of release date. And just before I do that, please make sure to subscribe as it helps me out a lot. Speaking about support, you can support me on my Patreon or my channel memberships for as little as $1 a month, where you get access to videos early. Click the little Patreon card on the screen at the moment, or otherwise you can click the little join button next to the subscribe button to join. Anyways, let's start off with the first DCAU video game. The first DCAU video game? And surprisingly, it came out in 1993. Only a year into Batman the Animated Series' run, but it definitely isn't good. There are things to like about this game though, since it's basically just a poor man's version of Batman on the NES. Music's actually really good, especially for the Game Boy. Same as the art style, it actually looks solid. And lastly, being able to teabag people is always fun. That's honestly it for the positives. So as the negatives go, the controls are quite janky, but with the controls I feel like it's kind of a given since it's a Game Boy game, and most Game Boy games have some really weird controls. The level layout's really strange sometimes, to the point where it's extremely confusing where to go. It isn't terrible, but it definitely gets annoying. The enemy spawns are really annoying, especially with the teddy bombs, since new ones instantly spawn like right next to where they just blew up, so you really have the smallest window to actually get past without getting hit. Lastly, the hitboxes are fucking huge. Some things that shouldn't hit would actually end up hitting you, which is obviously really annoying, because you shouldn't be getting hit by things, but you're taking damage. I don't really have much else to say about this game, but as one of the first Batman games goes, it isn't terrible. Definitely gets better, but also worse from here. The only Super Nintendo game on this list is from Konami. This game released in 1994, and there honestly isn't really much of a story to this game. It basically just has Batman facing off against some of his rogues gallery, and that's really it. One thing I do want to mention though is that every version of this game is slightly different, especially the Sega CD version, where they actually had cutscenes in the game. With those cutscenes, they were actually done by the same animation studio that worked on Batman the Animated Series. It's interesting since the art style is faithful to the series, but some of the things that happened in the game definitely aren't. Anywho, as the SNES game goes, there are some positives and negatives. I really like the music in this game. It fucking slaps, and it slaps that hard that I used it for my Batman the Animated Series video. The art style's adapted really well in this game, and because of that, the game looks really nice. I'm glad that this game doesn't have a confusing level layout, since it's just a side-scroller with a few missions where you have to use a bit of strategy to continue. The last thing I think that's worth mentioning is that I like Batman's idle animation. Obviously, this thing's kind of inspired by Sonic, but it really suits the style of Batman in the DCAU. Now onto the negatives. The controls definitely aren't great, but not terrible. Sometimes they just feel really weird and don't quite do exactly what you want them to do. There are some weird glitches in this game, especially when you're fighting the giant toy soldier, but you kind of get pushed back and forth when climbing up to hit the head. It gets to the point where sometimes you actually get stuck on the toy soldier for a few seconds and can't avoid taking damage, which can be annoying, especially when you're nearly dead. When I use the grapple in this game, sometimes it actually goes and latches onto where I want it to, but sometimes it just decides, fuck it, I'm gonna go where I want. Also, why the hell do you only have 3 pauses when playing this game? People have a life outside the game and they might want to pause more than 3 times? Well, see, this game has weird password codes, like what the fuck is this? We really need a 4x4 grid with an option of 3 different symbols, just so people can go to whatever level they want easier? What's wrong with a 5-letter code? That's much easier and works much better. Overall, with the game, it's a decent side-scroller. The style of the game really overshadows the actual gameplay itself, since the gameplay is extremely average, especially at a time where you also had some extremely good games and extremely bad ones. Anywho, the next few games get much worse, so fuck it, let's just start with oh boy. So this is the Game Boy game based on Superman the Animated Series that was released 2 years before the infamous Superman 64. And fun fact, this is actually made by the same people as that game. Great. This is one game where I honestly don't have any real positives, besides from the game not taking that long to beat. But talking about that, the first level's so fucking hard. It's insane how hard this first level is, especially when playing it for the first time since you don't know what to do and just manage to die in half a second. But you get to the second level and it's a million times easier. I managed to get through the second level on my first go, but the first level literally took me about 15 minutes. The thing that makes this game so hard though is that the levels are confusing, especially where the keys are located in the first level. Shit's hard to find, and with that the controls definitely don't help either. With the controls you feel like you're on ice, you're constantly sliding everywhere, even when you're flying. You don't sharply turn direction, it's just like you're sliding around. It's fucking annoying. Sometimes when I'm punching in the game, you magically break the bounds of reality, which is really weird. Like the game literally freezes for a millisecond when punching someone. Also with that, when you're trying to get through the level and hit the enemies, why the hell are there grenades just sitting in the air? It's literally there just to be an inconvenience for Superman, even though we're already being shot at by every bad guy on the screen, and we take damage from running into them anyways. It becomes infuriating very fast. Lastly, the music's awful. It sounds like nothing from the show, and it's honestly quite annoying to listen to. It may seem like I'm being too harsh on a Game Boy game, but this game's fucking awful. There's no other way to say it. This game sucks. But you know what? We now have an infamously terrible game to talk about. God, I'm not looking forward to this game at all, but to distract from the gameplay. This was released in 1999, obviously for the Nintendo 64, and it's from the same company as the last Superman game, Titus. What is the story of this game? Well, the story is that Lex managed to trap Jimmy, Lewis, and Professor Hamilton in a virtual reality version of Metropolis with Brainiac's help. So now Superman has to go into the virtual world to save them. Now it's time to talk about the gameplay. But surprisingly, I have a couple of positives. Character designs are okay, considering it's a Nintendo 64, which isn't saying much since the graphics have aged terribly. Even though I absolutely hate the ring segments, and I'll get to that very soon. With the rings, you can actually see by colour if you will automatically lose by skipping them, with the next one being green, but if you accidentally skip that one and get to a yellow one, it's alright. It's only if you skip more than 3 rings that you'll fail the mission, since when you start a ring segment, only 3 past the green one are yellow, and that's the only amount you're allowed to skip. The last positive I have is that the world's surprisingly big for an N64 game, but the environments look like arse. Now let's get into what you're here for with this game. Me talking about how awful it is. Let's just get the main negative out of the way. The controls are fucking awful. Thank God I am not using a Nintendo 64 controller, otherwise this would actually be hell on earth. The ring segments are an absolute nightmare, which ties in with the terrible controls because it's so hard to navigate Superman through the rings. The worst part about all of this is that if you fail after the rings when you go to a different gameplay segment, your ass gets sent straight back to the start of the ring segment. I never thought I would hate hearing Tim Daly's Superman, but the phrase, "there's no time to waste," traumatizes me. That's not even the worst part about the ring segments, because after you do a few of them, they actually get so fucking hard to the point where you can't miss a single ring. With the other segments of the game where you're saving people or punching bad guys, the game can be so cheap. I had moments where literally as soon as the ring segment's over, the next one instantly starts, so you'll end up losing and have to do the ring segment all over again. So with all this hell you have to go through with the normal missions in the game, you would assume that the boss fights are hard, but no. When you finally get to those boss fights, they're so easy and they easily get their asses kicked. I couldn't finish this game. Well, I could if I tried, but it's more I didn't want to. I played it for a couple of hours and I'm not gonna lie, there was a few moments where I wanted to throw my controller through my fucking window. It's one of those games that you really don't know how bad it is until you decide to actually play it and give it a shot. Also, how the fuck did the Game Boy game manage to be better than this version? To end this off though, there was meant to be a PlayStation version that got cancelled, which actually looks much more playable than this. When I tried to play the leaked alpha version of the PlayStation version of the game, it just didn't work on my emulator. Also, a cool thing about the cancelled PlayStation version is that you're actually meant to run into more well-known Superman villains. But you know what? Let's go from Superman being shat on in a video game to Batman Beyond. A Batman game made by Ubisoft? Surprisingly, yes, and most of the Batman games from here on out are made by Ubisoft. The game came out a month before the movie in the year 2000, and as the story goes, it just follows the movie but really rushes through the plot with screenshots of the movie, with text showing what the characters are meant to be saying, even though the text is different to the movie. But in the game though, I have one positive, and it's that you have choices of different suits. The different suits don't really mean much, but it's cool to have different suit choices for different styles of gameplay. Which is a really cool idea, but unfortunately doesn't affect the game that much. But holy shit, Batman fucking runs and punches like he's Sonic the Hedgehog. Why is he so fast? Maybe it's something to do with my emulator. I don't know, but what don't I like about this game? Why is the music completely different to what's in the movie, especially when it doesn't sound near as good as the soundtrack in the movie? Also, the music fucking loops and it will make your ears bleed. What a surprise, this game looks terrible as well. I think it's just a given with N64 games, as I mentioned with Superman 64. It's also quite disappointing that there's no voice lines from any characters in this game at all, especially considering that this was released on the N64 and PlayStation. Shit, even Superman 64 had fucking voice lines. Like 4 of them, but it's better than 0. The jumping in this game is awful since it's like he's just jumping on the spot. Even when you try to move your thumbstick to make him jump forward, it makes you move a little bit further, but barely at all. Speaking about that, the controls are really clunky. It just feels extremely weird to move around the 3D space of this game. It doesn't quite go the direction you want it to. My biggest question is, why the hell is the punch the most powerful thing in this game? Don't even bother using the weapons since you can just spam punch and do more damage than what the weapons do. The gameplay gets extremely repetitive. Most of the time you're just fighting the same types of enemies. Even when you get to boss fights, they're just extremely similar to the typical enemies you fight. Let me just say it, this game's awful. It's not a fun game, but the only thing to do that's actually fun is just spam punch since it's so fast and hilarious. See, it's another Ubisoft Batman game, but on the Game Boy Color and released in 2001. It's basically that Batman's villains have escaped Arkham and Batman has to stop them. What do I like about this game though? Well, visually the game looks really good considering that it's a Game Boy Color game. The controls are actually quite solid and work pretty well. And lastly, I like how you can give yourself 1, 3 or 5 tries in the game's menu if you want to make the game easier or harder for yourself. It's just good to have that option for players. But yeah, of course I have my negatives and the biggest one is the bloody music loop. Why do games around this time insist on having music loops that are grating on your ears? Surprisingly, another negative that I have for this game is that it's way too easy. It's quite easy to get through the game and doesn't really give you that much of a challenge. One thing that does give you a bit of a challenge though is the collision boxes and the platforming. It just doesn't quite work the way you want it to, such as the collision boxes that are just too big compared to your sprite. With the platforming though, the opposite's true. When you're trying to climb up onto a platform, sometimes there are platforms where you have to be in an extremely specific spot to climb up, which definitely gets annoying. But you know what? It's definitely not a bad game. It's quite fun actually for just being a simple side-scrolling beat 'em up. And it works at doing that. Alright, it's gonna be disappointing. I can't actually get this game to work, but for the version I can play that's basically missing every texture, the controls are terrible. Feels like you're constantly driving on ice, and that's all you do in the game is just chase after bad guys in a Batmobile. You know what? I'm actually kind of glad that I don't have to play this game, since what I played, it fucking sucked. So this is the first PS2 game based on the DCAU? Well, I'm definitely interested to see if it's any good. Batman Vengeance came out in 2001 for the PS2, Xbox, PC, and GameCube, which is meant to be in the universe of the new Batman Adventures, even though that show ended 2 years before this game came out. Since this game is meant to be a part of the DCAU, the story follows Batman investigating the supposed death of the Joker that we actually get to play at the start of the game, as he has to deal with other villains that are up to their usual schemes. It all ends up becoming a massive plot that the Joker orchestrated himself, where he tricked all the other villains that we fight against in the game into helping him make a flammable Joker toxin. I actually really like the plot of this game, since it feels like a 2-parter or a 3-parter that you'd actually see in the show, and it perfectly makes sense in this universe. I do have more positives for this game as well, with one of them being the art style. I was skeptical when saying that this game adapts the 2D style of the new Batman Adventures, but puts it in 3D, but it works surprisingly well. Especially the cutscenes, they look really good for 2001. Having the original voice actors is great, since I don't think the game would work so well if they just had different voices for the cast and still tried to connect it to the same universe. Lastly, the variety of gameplay styles throughout the game is neat. The game doesn't get repetitive because the game actually changes the style from time to time and gives you different things to do in different ways to beat the villains. As much as I like this game though, there are a few negatives, with the biggest one being the fixed camera. It can become extremely annoying sometimes where the camera just faces you in a way where you can't see anything. With that too, I will be facing a certain way wanting the camera to face the same way as Batman, but sometimes it just faces the complete opposite direction, and the way I found to fix it is by going to first person mode, moving the camera around, and then getting out of first person mode. That's the only way I could find to fix the weird camera angles. They are quite weird, especially when you're in first person mode and trying to use your gadgets. It's a great idea to change things up and have a first person mode to use your gadgets, but actually aiming them doesn't feel right. I feel like it's a bit too slow and a bit fidgety to try and aim yourself in the right direction to grapple yourself and use your gadgets. Besides that, I noticed that my emulator really doesn't like the cutscenes in this game for some reason. The game itself works fine, but it does have a few little weird texture bugs. Besides from that, the cutscenes are actually super choppy. If the game was running properly on my emulator, then shit, I would have sat there and played the whole game. I really enjoyed it. I was surprised to find out that this is a solid game with a good story that suits the world of the new Batman Adventures. Especially considering that most of the games I've already played haven't been good. But we go back to a Superman game with Atari worked on this game? I thought that they just kind of did nothing after the mid-80s, but apparently not. But this is yet another game based on the DCAU show that came out years after the show finished, since this game came out in 2002 and Superman the Animated Series finished in 2000. The story of this game is pretty simple, where a gang of robots are trying to get new weapons to destroy Superman and take over Earth, with even Darkseid being behind it. You run into other villains such as Parasite, which is Rudy, and Metallo, where he has a weird robot voice filter on, and I don't like it. Malcolm McDowell's voice is perfect on its own, you don't need to change it. Speaking about the voice actors, all of the original voices from the show are in the game, which is great since it makes you believe that this is actually meant to be a part of the DC animated universe. With that though, some of the extras and police officers have some terrible line deliveries that are actually hilarious.
Hey, Soups! Thanks again, buddy!
As the gameplay itself goes, the controls are actually solid. It just sucks not having the freedom to move the camera around. With that, when you're flying, it sucks that you can't go faster when holding a civilian, since your normal flight speed is actually very slow, so when you fly, you need to use the boost. As the actual missions go, they're quite fun. The only real problem I have is just knowing where you're meant to go and what you're meant to do sometimes. The game doesn't really do the best job at hinting you towards what you're meant to be doing sometimes, but other times it works just fine. Lastly, the game looks alright considering the style that they're going for, which was trying to mix the 3D style of Batman Vengeance with the 2D style of Superman the Animated Series. They tried to do what that game did as well, but they didn't do it quite as good as Batman Vengeance. There isn't too much to say about this game, but I did enjoy it quite a bit. It's just solid overall. Is this based on the two-parter of the same name in the show? No, it isn't, but it does combine a lot of stuff from the events throughout the show. Also, Midway made this game? I guess it was 2002 and they'll still be around for another 8 years after this, and technically they still are since most of Midway was brought out by WB and turned into NetherRealm Studios. I do have some good things to say about this game. The game itself looks nice, which I notice is quite a common thing with these DCAU games. Most of them manage to actually get the art style right, but also another positive I have is surprisingly the controls. They actually feel decent and do what they're meant to do. The negatives though are mainly just that you have to spam punch your way through boss fights, and that the level layouts can be really confusing sometimes. Besides that, it just works at being an easy to pick up beat 'em up style game for the Game Boy Advance. With games like this, there really just isn't much to say. Okay, so this is basically the GBA version of Shadow of Apocalypse since Atari worked on this game as well, but it came out a year later. This game for some reason felt like it needed to rush through Superman's origin story in the intro cutscene. I don't know why, but I guess they thought, fuck it, why not? I really only have one main positive for this game, it's that you can use your laser vision as much as you want and literally just kill people with it. That's the funnest part of this game without a doubt, just going up to criminals and lasering them to death. There are quite a few negatives even though I don't think the game's terrible. The main thing that really annoyed me is not being able to skip cutscenes or any dialogue. That shit got infuriating, especially when you die on a mission and have to go through all the dialogue all over again. I feel like not having any kind of navigation around the map to find criminals sucks, since it's hard to know the area well, and most of the time I ended up just going in circles trying to find more criminals to beat. Of course, this is yet another game with a really annoying music loop, but it definitely isn't the worst that I've heard. It just gets extremely repetitive. Lastly is that some of the special moves just work when they want to. There are some missions, such as when you have to take a tank down, where you have to use your freeze breath on it, and sometimes it just wouldn't work. You'd press the two buttons down to use your freeze breath, and it would just use your laser vision instead. But look, overall it's just a little fun game where you beat shit up as Superman. I don't hate it, but I wouldn't pick it up again. There really isn't much else to this game. So, let's go on to... Okay, so we got a follow-up to Batman Vengeance? This game came out in 2003 with the same people that made Batman Vengeance, which makes me beg the question, how does the game that came out 2 years before look better than this does? It doesn't make sense, especially since the cutscenes are the same quality, but I feel like it has something to do with the lighting in this game. It's much brighter and not as moody as Batman Vengeance. The story pacing is similar to Batman Vengeance, where you have separate chapters for different parts of the game that cover different Batman villains. This time around it goes Scarecrow, Clayface, Bane, and Sinsu, which is a brand new villain made for this game. The story is basically that Sinsu decides to attack on the anniversary of Bruce's parents' death after studying Batman for ages and learning how to attack him. Let me just say that it's a bit disappointing that this game's a beat 'em up instead of what Batman Vengeance was. To get the negatives out of the way, I really hate the repetitiveness of these missions. Every mission besides from the boss fights are just fight goons and save civilians. Shit gets so boring so fast, and these missions aren't short either. The first mission of this game, which is to save 6 civilians and then fight 25 criminals, took me almost 15 minutes the first time I played it. I wish that the gameplay would change up after having such a long and repetitive mission, but no. They're all the same besides the boss fight, which made me not even want to play the game anymore. But the worst part about this is that later on with these same types of missions, you'll have to save up to 9 civilians in the mission. The other negative I have is that the fixed camera angle definitely gets annoying, especially when you have to walk around a corner. It takes a good while for it to follow you. But that's something I can excuse since having a fixed camera angle like this was the norm at the time. I do have one really strange thing to mention though. So obviously the original voice cast returned to their roles in this game. But for some reason, Tim Drake's Robin, which is voiced by Matthew Valencia in the new Batman Adventures, is replaced by Scott Menville. It just doesn't make sense to me since Scott obviously voices Robin in Teen Titans, which is Dick Grayson, not Tim Drake. So was Matthew just not available to do it? I guess the creators just thought why not since Teen Titans came out the same year that this game did. There are some positives I have about the gameplay, even though it's extremely repetitive. I like how you can use your points from the missions to buy new moves. It encourages you to try and get as many points as possible in your missions to be able to unlock more moves. Even though the missions are really repetitive, the gameplay is fun since the moves you have are actually neat. The last thing is that I like how the boss fights look. They're all visually interesting, but most of them just tie back into button mashing your way into beating the boss, besides from Clayface. With Clayface you need to hit the electrical things on the sides to weaken him and then give you the chance to lay some hits on him. The game overall though is just a bit disappointing considering that I really enjoyed Batman Vengeance, but with this game I really didn't want to finish it because it just got boring and repetitive. It's not bad, but it's not very good either. It's just average. The last DCAU game, and it's made by both Midway and Full Fat. Why the hell is this game's company named Full Fat? Anywho, this game came out in 2003 and there isn't really a plot to this game. It's honestly just extremely simple because it's yet another beat 'em up style game. The music choice is extremely weird, but the goons you fight are just the same 2-styled goons in every level. Also, get used to the title screen music. It gets annoying very fast. Besides that, I really don't have much to say about this game. It's just very average and does what it does to a decent degree. So, I played all the DCAU video games. It's honestly such a mixed bag since you have some absolutely terrible games, some alright ones, and surprisingly a game or two that I actually like. With that though, let's rank these games from worst to best. The worst game, without a fucking doubt, is Superman 64. That game is an absolute fucking nightmare to play and I don't wish it on my worst enemy. Next is Batman Beyond Return of the Joker for the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation. It's surprisingly nearly as bad as Superman 64. Speaking about Superman 64, Superman on the Game Boy is next. Then Batman Gotham City Racer, which I'm glad that something gifted me the power of not finding a single version of the game that works properly, because it would probably be worse if I actually got to play it properly. But this is where we get to all of the decent games that are honestly just the beat 'em ups, starting with Batman the Animated Series on the Game Boy. Then Superman Countdown to Apocalypse for the Game Boy Advance, Batman Chaos in Gotham for the Game Boy Color, Justice League Chronicles for the Game Boy Advance, Justice League and Justice for All for the Game Boy Advance. The next is Batman Rise of Sin 2 for the PlayStation 2. Even though the missions are really repetitive, the gameplay can be fun from time to time. Now we get to the top 3, and we started off with The Adventures of Batman and Robin for the SNES. Then Superman Shadow for Apocalypse for the PlayStation 2. Then finally, the best DCAU game has to be Batman Vengeance for the PlayStation 2. God, looking back at all the games, there are so many beat 'em ups in this list, and that makes me wonder, did we really need so many? I was surprised to even find a game or two that I really enjoyed in this list, since I was honestly impressed with Batman Vengeance and I really liked that game a lot. That's one game that actually feels like a predecessor to the Arkham games, which is extremely impressive for 2001. But as most of the games in the franchise go, I wouldn't even bother playing them besides the top 4. Anyways, you should definitely like the video if you enjoyed it, and if you enjoy my content, you should make sure to click that little subscribe button. Lastly, make sure to check out my Patreon or channel memberships, as those two things really help me out a lot whilst I'm working on big videos such as my Justice League video. Speaking about that, let's just get straight into the shoutouts. Massive thanks to Ash Crimson and Brady for supporting my channel license tier. And lastly, massive thanks to Fatima, Victoria Huntley, and SamMam1994 for supporting my Big Boss tier. If you want to find out how you can get your name at the end of my videos, click the little Patreon logo on screen at the moment, or click the little join button next to the subscribe button. Anyways, I shall see you on the next video.